Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you joining us tonight for this webinar in celebration of Women's History Month, focusing on the intersection of women's empowerment and economics and how the two play a role within each other. I'm really excited that we're going to be hearing from four different panelists who we will introduce momentarily about their research, their experience in this field, and understanding how we can really make sense of this and help students understand it a little bit better as well. With that said, we do want to start off, of course, with a little bit of content and sharing what we have available on Sphere Education's website. Again, Sphere Education provides content that is free and available for you at any time that you are interested on our website, sphere-ed.org. And again, it is all free, nonpartisan, and viewpoint diverse. I'm going to kick it to my colleague, Kobe Nelson, to show us a little bit more about it.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you tonight. Thank you so much for joining. We're very excited to host this webinar tonight about women and economics. And like Elise said, before we get started, I just wanted to highlight some of our lessons that we have on our Sphere Ed website. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to share about 6 lessons in the chat. So you're welcome to look at them as I'm talking. And then I will highlight one at the end. So we have several sets of lessons that are connected to Heroes of Progress and Centers of Progress, which Chelsea Follett is here today and representing, and she has written Centers of Progress and oversees the Heroes of Progress and Human Progress. So we're very excited to have her here, and she brought books. So one piece that I would like to talk about and start with is I'm going to go historically. So those of you who enjoy historical, chronological ways of thinking about things, you'll appreciate this. But first, I want to highlight a Centers of Progress lesson that is about Paris and the Enlightenment. And this particular lesson has an extension activity that's phenomenal and asks students to learn about the French salons, which were often hosted by influential women in their private homes. And these were places where women were able to find a space to speak intellectually with one another about the arts and about intellectual things that were not necessarily encouraged during that time. So this is a phenomenal lesson. I would encourage you to check that out. The next one is a lesson about Mary Estelle and Mary Wollstonecraft. This is a lesson about 2 feminist authors who helped form the basis of female empowerment right around the Enlightenment. So they spoke out regarding the poor education of women in particular, and they believe that women should be more educated and that education itself should be reformed. You may also recognize those of you who teach ELA, Mary Wollstonecraft not only wrote the Rights of Women, but she was also the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. So that's a fun connection to make. Thirdly, we have Kate Sheppard, and Kate Sheppard was a pioneering suffragist from New Zealand. And New Zealand granted women the right to vote in 1893, which was actually before the United States. So, oh, I just realized I did not put the link of Estelle and Wollstonecraft. Sorry about that. There it is. All right, here's Kate Sheppard. So Kate Sheppard, pioneering suffragist again from New Zealand, and we have a wonderful lesson that details that and shows the progress that she was able to make in speaking out in particular about the right of women to vote. Our next hero of progress that we would like to highlight is Lucy Wills, and here's the link for Lucy Wills, I think. There we go. Lucy Wills is a research physician who discovered the link between nutrition and mother-child health, and particularly related to anemia and how anemia could be alleviated just by nutrition, and it would positively affect the mother's health and reduce child mortality. So this is a fantastic lesson. And then we have Pearl Kendrick and Grace Eldering. Those of you who have received or, maybe have children who received the DTaP vaccine recently, you will recognize this because they actually created the whooping cough vaccine, the DTaP, around the 1930s and 40s. And they did pioneering research so that we wouldn't have to have as much whooping cough, which if you've ever had a child who's gone through that is really not fun. Um, all right. And then we have 2UU. 2UU made some excellent progress with research on anti-malarial medicine in the last half of the 20th century. And this truly has changed a lot of lives because malaria is such a devastating disease in many countries. So this one is a fantastic one to introduce students to, especially, as kind of like I would say a side lesson. Like, for example, if you read any books like The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind or things like that, that really speak to malaria, and kind of you see the characters who are dealing with the effects of malaria. This is a wonderful one to pair because then you can speak to the progress of 2UU, who has helped significantly. And finally, I would like to highlight a lesson, and I'm going to share my screen very quickly. This is a lesson. We are privileged to have Rosemary Fike here, and we have a lesson that particularly targets her and her work. So let's see. Are we seeing this? No, maybe
Not
not
yet.
yet. Not yet. Thank you. Now are we? Are we good?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So, Rosemarie Fike is a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute, and she not only speaks, but she has done some pioneering research about the effect of economics on women, and particularly how economic institutions affect women's status and their lives. And as you all know, this is a key point that we are highlighting tonight. And this lesson in particular really asks students, if you kind of look through it, I will try not to give you too much vertigo as I'm scrolling down, but it asks students to really think about where they are, the progress that has been made for them, for their family members, and then taking perspectives of perhaps women who lived in the past and were not the beneficiaries of the economic progress that we are really honestly privileged to be a part of in this country right now. So that being said, I will also put this lesson in the chat, and I encourage you to check it out. And I'm going to kick it back to my colleague Elise so that we can get started with our wonderful panel.
Here we go. Thanks so much, Kobe. As Kobe had mentioned, we have a wide breadth of resources that are out there that are free and available to you. The links are in the chat. But again, you can explore all of our content library on sphere-ed.org, and then you can just click on classroom content, and then you will see the different collections we have for a wide range of disciplines. What's really nice about the Heroes and Centers of Progress lessons is that they are, of course, very applicable for social studies, but they're also applicable to bring into your ELA classroom if you're an ELA instructor. And Chelsea's got the books that she was holding up. There is an actual physical book. We actually just sent out an email yesterday about our human progress boxes. If you're interested in a human progress kit, let us know. Supplies are very limited, so we're working now on like the next wave of, if you are interested, putting you on that wait list for the upcoming fall. But again, we offer a lot of resources that are good, again, not just for ELA and social studies, but you can bring it into your econ class if you are an econ instructor and you want to highlight an individual and use some of the material that is going to come out of the discussion in your class. Use one of these lessons as a really wonderful resource too. integrate and spark some of the discussion, particularly for our friends that are AP and that are looking for things post AP testing to do. I'm a former AP US history teacher, and I do remember that as soon as the test ended, that was it, right? Like you had to figure out exactly what you were going to do because they were already done learning exactly, the content for the test that they needed. So these are some really fun lessons that you can integrate at any point of the year, but it's a wonderful piece for transitioning into summer. That said, one gentle reminder before we do get started for our panel is Sarah put in the chat, just a reminder to please have your full name represented for Zoom. There's an easy way to change it. She put instructions there, but we need that in order to provide you with a professional development certificate. Any questions that you have also as we go along the way, please put it in the chat and we will have time for Q&A with all of our panelists after we end our discussion and provide plenty of time to get all your questions answered. So we'll be monitoring that in the chat and making sure that we have those documented. That said, so excited to introduce our panelists tonight. We have four wonderful individuals. I'm going to first start off with Rosemary Fike, who is an instructor of economics at Texas Christian University and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. She is the individual that Kobe was referring to for the lesson that is in the chat again. Really excited to have her joining with us tonight. She's the author of the Woman in Progress Report series and the host of the Essential Scholars podcast, the Realities of Socialism podcast, and Women, Economic Progress and Markets podcast. Her research focuses on understanding the role that economic institutions play in improving the lives and status of women around the world. And she's received numerous accolades, including the Addington Prize for Measurement for her work on how to account for gender difference in economic rights when measuring the quality of a country's institutions. Really excited to have you joining us, Rosemary. Next, we have Chelsea Pollitt, who I know we mentioned before, around the Human Progress content. She is the managing editor of humanprogress.org, which is a project at the Cato Institute that seeks to educate the public on global improvements, hence the name Human Progress that we've got there, and well-being by providing free empirical data on long-term developments. Excellent charts that are there, highly recommend. Her writing has been featured in numerous articles and websites, including Newsweek, Forbes, USA Today, The Hill. She was named to Forbes 30 Under 30 list in 2018 in the category of law and policy. We are really excited to have her joining us tonight. Next up, we have, and again, really excited that we have a panel of four amazing women in this field to speak to this. Kim Holder. Kim Holder is the managing director at the Center for Economic Education at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. She's an expert in innovative teaching methods. She's co-authored multiple texts, including The Ultimate Guide to Teaching Macroeconomics. We love macroeconomics. And the off-campus study abroad and study away in economics. She specialized in using popular media to make economics more accessible and has contributed to digital teaching guides and materials for numerous publishers, including Macmillan, Pearson, Microsoft Education. Her work in economics education has earned recognition by numerous organizations as well, including the Southern Economic Association's Kenneth G. Elzinga Distinguished Teaching Award, and also the National Association of Economics Educators Rising Star Award. She's a mentor and leader in the economics education community, and we are so thrilled to have her as well. And last but not least, we have Jamie Lemke, who is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and a senior fellow in the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Her specialization is in public choice economics, institutional analysis, and the political economy of women's rights. In addition to her work on the evolution of women's economics rights and opportunities in the U.S. and U.S. history, she's written multiple publications on public choice and institutional theory as applied to policing, higher education, and local public services. She's the co-editor with Virgil H. Storr of Economy, Polity, and Society, an interdisciplinary book series in political economy published by Bloomsbury. We're really excited to have her joining us as well. So thrilled that we have you all here tonight. We're going to start with a more just anchoring general question that really hinges on, why are we here, right? As we celebrate Women's History Month, we know that economics is important. We know Women's History Month is important, but what's the connection? So when we're thinking about this, how can we use use this occasion to deepen our understanding of how women's economic advancements correlate with overall progress of society. Given each of your research backgrounds, would love to hear some of your thoughts about this, how we can ground our understanding on that, and how we can make sense of how the intersection of women and economics actually benefits society as a whole. So we'll go in alphabetical order from how we started with the bios just to get started. Rosemary, we can start with you. We'll kick it to Chelsea. We'll then kick it to Kim and Jamie. And I see it also on our Zoom block, so this is perfect.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you tonight and talk about women's economic rights. One of the things that I really like to think about in terms of, why economic rights are important, not just for women, but why women's economic rights are important for everybody. I think about Adam Smith, and when Adam Smith talked about what creates, what is the source of the wealth of nations, he talks about the division of labor. And our ability to grow and prosper as a society under the division of labor is limited by the scope of our market. So, how many people we are interacting with and trading with. Limiting women's economic rights means we are shrinking the scope of our market by about 50% of the population. And so, in places where women have really severe restrictions on their ability to fully participate in the economy, we're leaving lots of money on the table in terms of unrealized trade.
Absolutely. Chelsea, I think you're on mute.
Absolutely. I want to echo all of that. Economic rights, economic freedom, they benefit everyone, but perhaps for no group is that more clear than for women. Over the last 200 or so years, we have seen an explosion in living standards. You can find all sorts of data on that on humanprogress.org, but perhaps for no group is that more obvious than for women. I wrote a paper a while back on specifically how economic freedom has arguably disproportionately benefited women in at least two ways. One would be that innovations that come out of free enterprise, out of the free market, have disproportionately benefited women because women still today in every society that I'm aware of in the world do the majority of housework. And so if you have technology taking over some of that work, it frees up more of women's time disproportionately. And market-driven innovations have also freed up more of women's life years. It's actually extended their health, their longevity more than men, and have allowed women to enter the labor market and through having those economic rights, increase their bargaining power in society and flourish in all sorts of ways that also benefits, of course, the broader society.
Thanks for that, Chelsea. Kim, would love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, so like Rosemary said, thanks for letting me be part of this. My work is in econ ed, so I may take a little bit different angle at it. I really think about it as not, you know, why are, it's often phrased as like, why are women important in society versus some other group? Or why is this person important in society versus another group? And I think that I really want to push that it's a both and that, it is more people, more contributions, more innovation. But it also is really about expanding our choice set and having the freedom to choose of what is going to optimize for myself. And when I'm able to do that for myself, for my family, for my loved ones, at this very local individual level, society as a whole benefits. So that's like a core principle in econ. If you believe that core principle in econ, then you should be very much for giving women more ability, opportunity, and freedoms just as another player in the game. And so I think we need to think of it not just how can breaking down barriers for women help the economy, how can breaking down barriers for anyone, including women, help the economy as a whole.
So before I answer and add to my colleague's wonderful responses there. I just want to say how cool it is to be here having this conversation. I think a lot about how few generations ago it was that women did not have economic rights in this country. Even my grandmother lived in a time when she would have had to get permission to get a credit card or a mortgage. There were institutions of higher education she was excluded from. You add a grade to that. There were a lot of jobs that women weren't allowed to do in that generation. Lack of ability to vote at the national level and at many state levels. Add another one or two greats, and women don't have property rights at all. That's just not that many mothers back. And so, kind of the progress of the last 200 years and the incredible economic growth we've seen over that period of time runs right alongside this story of women's emancipation that's taken place over the same period of time. So women entering the labor force, it's done all these things that the others talked about, like adding innovation, increasing competition and productivity in the economy. But it's also, rebounded and enriched these women's lives in a way that enabled them to enter the public sphere and allowed our society to develop um, ways of relating to each other that are equitable and allow people free choices in how it is that they want to live their life instead of forcing women down just particular rabbit holes. Um, in addition to Smith, Rosie took the Smith right out of my mouth. But I'll throw out just another idea from a famous 20th century economist this time, Friedrich Hayek, because he reminded us that we don't know where the next great innovation is going to come from, and that there's actually a lot we don't understand at progress. And so to maximize our chances of advancement as a society, we need to give ourselves as many rolls of the dice as possible. And that essentially means bringing as many brains and as many entrepreneurial spirits into the market as we can. So yeah, just leaving, like Rosie said, 50%, usually actually a little more than that of the population just out of that equation. Um, it's something that hindered growth for some period of time until we could start to rectify that and really bring women into the public space. And I know we're going to talk a little bit in some of the later questions about the ways that women's contributions are still limited around the world. But I'll stop there because I won't give in to the temptation of just talking for the whole hour about how great it is for women to get access to the market.
We could literally make this webinar hours long, right? Delving into the historical aspects from past to present, not just globally, but domestically, right? It's a really rich history. And to your point, Jamie, that when teaching students about this in any discipline that it might arise in, it can seem so far based on, if they are in high school or in middle school, right? Or really any school age child is born after 2000, like they're not thinking back to the 20th century and maybe hearing a closer narratives around how certain things might have been depending on where they are globally, right? Or even thinking about something that we talked about before of understanding banking and legalese issues and things that women had to face around having to have permissions. So in line with that mindset, what are some of the obstacles that you've identified in each of your given areas of research that you think are particularly notable to provide information to teachers and students on in relation to this topic? What are the significant obstacles in relation to women's economic mobility? And, what are maybe some actionable strategies that we could examine or that have occurred? Chelsea, I know you've done some research in this area around tech, and each of you have focused on this as well in your independent areas. Why don't we reverse it? And Jamie, let's start with you, and we'll go Kim, and then Chelsea and Rosemary.
Sure. I'm the historian of the group, maybe. Well, I know Chelsea does a lot of historical work as well too. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do through politics that limits women's ability to get into the market. It was not very long after women acquired property rights in the first place and began to compete with men in the marketplace that different political strategies were devised to try to shut down that competition so that and a lot of the rhetoric around the time was that of the male breadwinner. We have to prioritize. We're actually hearing some of that a little bit again today. We have to prioritize the male breadwinner in terms of access to job opportunities. So in the early 20th century, there was a huge slate of laws that limited when women were allowed to work, the number of hours they were allowed to work, and the jobs that they were allowed to take. And again, these laws applied only to women. And so I think analytically, the idea of viewing politics and our regulatory agencies as the gatekeepers to the market sets up the opportunity for this kind of thing to happen. Because if you live in a society that has norms and beliefs about what women should be allowed to do, what it's safe for women to do, about the activities they should be putting their energy into instead, then you have that apparatus that exists that already strong, previously existing interest groups that are going to be dominated by male workers can easily exploit to prevent women from competing with them. So I think that political control of the market, allowing that gatekeeping to take place, is a major restriction and a source of rigidity that we should be really concerned about. Um, and yeah, I'm sure my colleagues will have a lot of examples of ways that that still manifests today in our contemporary economy.
I'll hop in. I think I'm next. Is that right? So I agree with everything that Jamie's saying, and particularly, it just hasn't been that long since we had access to a lot of rights, and then at the same time, they're you know quickly eroding as well. And so I think that it's something that we need to kind of know our history and know how far we've come, and also know why it's important for people to advocate for our own freedoms and ability to make the choices that are best for ourselves. Um, I think for me, the big barrier that I see in terms of just the educational landscape is that um, growing up, all of the children's shows that I watched lied to me, and they told me I could be anything that I wanted to be. That, I could go to school, I could, have any type of job, I could be a scientist if I wanted to be. And then when I got out into the real world, I realized actually, no, I can't. If there are certain choices that I made along the way that then limited what other things I could choose. So I got married very young. I had children very young. I married someone who we still live in his hometown. So geographically, I was constrained. I was constrained by the access to education, depending upon, where the university system was. All those things are limiting things. And so if I was talking to, young Kim today, I would say you can be anything you want, but like with a little asterisk beside it. And I'd like to get rid of that asterisk, right? That it shouldn't be there, not just for women, but for all people. And so what I think we're doing in our educational system that's a little wonky is we ask people to choose really, really early on. Those of you who have taught in middle school, sometimes it even happens like late elementary, where we put people on these tracks and then we send them off eventually to college or to trade school or whatever, and then we put them on another track. And then you think that's the only thing that you can do. And as a non-traditional student who had lots of different pathways, I think that's something that's an unnecessary obstacle, that we need to be more creative and more innovative about what you can do with your life and your career, and that you might have multiple careers, and you might have one while you have young kids and a different one later on. So I just think it's an unnecessary barrier.
That is a very good segue into what I want to talk about, which is about how a lot of these historical barriers that we discuss do still persist today, especially if you're looking at less developed parts of the world. So the ways that I was talking about earlier in which women have received more time thanks to the innovations of the marketplace, that's wonderful, but it has not reached everyone equally. So let me paint you a picture. In the year 1800, the typical American woman had 7 children, which is quite a lot. Only 4 of them would survive to age 5. The other 3 would typically die from ailments that today, thanks to the wealth and better nutrition and sanitation that we have in modern medicine, are easily preventable or treatable. I've had some firsthand experience with that this week when my youngest was diagnosed with scarlet fever, which sounded really terrifying to me, but the doctor that diagnosed her said immediately afterwards, "Oh, it's not scary anymore. We can treat it with antibiotics. It's gone from something that was, it had about a 30% rate of mortality. I looked that up at its worst to something that now has an extremely good prognosis. And as more children have survived, people tend to have fewer children. They no longer have many children as sort of an insurance policy against childhood death. And we've seen something in every country as it's developed called the fertility transition. And having fewer children who are also healthier and who survive to adulthood then gives you more life years, more time to engage in activities other than rearing children. So as Kim talked about, there are trade-offs, right? With every decision you make. When you have a child, that takes up a certain amount of time, and it might, depending on your circumstances, impede your ability to engage in some economic activities. But we're now seeing more and more women around the world having those opportunities. Maternal mortality also used to be devastating. It used to be the case that if you're having 7 children on average, and there was about a 1% chance of death from every childbirth, that you were looking at a lifetime a chance of about a 7% likelihood of dying in childbirth. Even as that came down later on in 1900 or so, the US rate of maternal death was still about as dangerous as having breast cancer today. So it was a very dangerous situation. And if you look at rates of maternal mortality around the world, it is plummeting everywhere, but there are still huge disparities. And so depending on how wealthy your country is, how economically developed it is, women can have very different fates. Dying in childbirth is still a big risk in many areas. And so I just want to emphasize that a lot of these historical problems that we talk about, that story of women's liberation from poverty and having access to engaging in economic activity, that is ongoing around the world today.
Can I just add one quick thing to that? That was lovely and so important. Mary Wollstonecraft is one of these women who died in childbirth. One of the reasons we only got kind of 2 major treatises from her is that she died so young. And that's the case of many of the kind of prominent intellectual contributors we know. She died because of lack of sanitation during childbirth. But there's a wonderful book called Romantic Outlaws about that it's a dual biography of her life and Mary Shelley's life and how they faced different situations just that generation apart. It's really excellent.
So I want to pick up on something that Chelsea brought up in the beginning of her comments, which is, even though our current lived experience in the United States is that women, at least under the formal law, have, no barriers to their economic rights that men don't also face. But in a lot of the world, not even just underdeveloped countries, but a lot of the world, there's at least some sort of legal restriction on the types of occupations that women are or are not allowed to undertake. There's over 105 countries in the world have some sort of law on the books that say, women can't work a job that deals with pesticides or works in a dangerous occupation or work at night. And so that just limits the options that are on the table. Even as norms change over time and women have fewer children and they have more free time, if there are still barriers to in the law against what they're able to do with their time, it cuts off opportunities to better their lives. I always think of one of my favorite examples that stands out is Belarus did not they have a law on the books where you're not allowed to work with pesticides if you're a woman. And while my dreams and aspirations may not be to open up a pest control business, there may be some women where that is their best opportunity to improve their life and to improve the situation of their children. And to have a law on the books that says, no, you can't even try this out. You can't even, like, you might fail, but to have a law that says you can't even try, you don't even have permission to go and attempt this activity is really unnecessary, right? If it's really true that the woman isn't going to do well in that industry, the market will let them know pretty quickly that they're not going to succeed, and they'll do something else. We don't really need the legal barrier to entry. But I think about, economic rights as the ability to go out there and discover the kind of person you want to be and what kind of life you want to live. And having laws on the books that say these choices are not for you, that really that stagnates our progress, right? I can't be a trailblazer in a male-dominated industry if there's some law in place that says, no, you can't even try this. So to me, the kind of biggest challenges to women and their economic mobility today are some of these laws that exist widespread, in Latin American countries and Eastern European countries. They're all over the world. It's pretty low-hanging fruit to take something like that off the books.
I think that's an excellent segue into the next question, which is just really hitting on what each of you have spoken about, which are some of the impact versus intent, or the intent versus impact, right? Of what some of the laws are intended to produce as an outcome, but then maybe there's an unintended consequence, or maybe it works out, right? And this is not just a domestic issue, but a global issue. I wonder if you can each speak to maybe some of the unintended consequences and intended consequences that come out of some of the laws that are, related to trying to uplift women economically, and particularly looking at free societies. When we're examining that, 'cause we're thinking about back to the first question about how does helping women economically, but not even just women, when we broach that, as you put perfectly, Kim, we think about everybody, uplifting them economically. What are some of the impacts from that? And then also hitting at, as a more nuanced level, some of the disparities, right? So we know that this is not just can't just generalize it. So when we're thinking about whether it's getting to the global connection, like you were making Rosemary and Chelsea about this, and we think back to whether it's in Latin America or we're looking at a Nordic country, two very different areas, two very different legal systems, some of the similar unintended and intended consequences, but even more so domestically, right? When we're thinking about socioeconomic or race, gender, right? All of these different particular pieces. So I'd love if each of you could speak to that. And why don't we shake it up a bit, and we can start with Chelsea, and then we can go to Kim, and then Rosemary, and then Jamie.
Thank you so much. That is a really important topic in economics. We always like to think about unintended consequences, and particularly when it comes to policies that are attempting to empower women. I think sometimes people can fail to see the full picture. So there are lots of different policies that have tried to make things easier for women, but they always come with trade-offs, and it's important to remember that. So Scandinavia is an area of the world, again, thinking globally, that people like to point to as a sort of utopia for women, or it's an area of the world that scores very high in gender equality. It's considered to be probably a more gender equal society than the United States in many ways, in many of these Scandinavian countries. But there are some areas where women in the US do actually score better. It depends on what metric you're looking at, obviously, but there's been some interesting work by an economist called Nima Sanandaji on what he calls the Nordic glass ceiling, where he looks at women's economic participation in the Nordic countries versus in the US and finds that in the Nordic countries, despite this greater perceived level, at least of gender equality, women are less likely to rise up to the upper ranks of the business world. They're less likely to be CEOs. They're less likely to be at the top of companies. So what's going on there? It seems like a lot of different legal protections that they enjoy there might actually be discouraging companies from hiring or promoting women. There was also an interesting study in California where there's a sort of natural experiment where some places rolled out a policy of workplace protections for women before others. And what they found was that it did seem to sadly discourage women from being hired in the places where they received greater protections. So basically, you were probably having bosses either consciously or subconsciously go through a calculus of saying, well, this employee is more likely to be able to sue, so I should just hire a man instead. Now, that's not to advocate for or against the policies, but just to recognize that all policies do come with trade-offs and unintended consequences when they alter incentives. You see this a lot also with the paid leave debate. There has been a lot of interesting research on how that affects whether or not women are more or less likely to be hired. So it complicates a lot of these debates. It would be better, obviously, if we lived in a simple world where just passing a policy to make life easier for women had no other consequences that could actually make things harder for women. But unfortunately, reality is a bit more complicated than that.
Thanks for that, Kim. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to put that hashtag, it's complicated on this whole thing. Like it is. It's very, very complicated. And to me, the unintended consequences often they come from a good place. They come from a we should care about women and women have the babies and they're going to need, prenatal care and aftercare. And so we should do something about that. But the unintended piece is that then women get penalized in the workplace on the hiring, or someone's trying to do something for you for your own good. And so my personal example would be when I was first hired to teach economics, I wasn't offered summer classes to teach because they knew I had young children and because another colleague who was a woman had never taught in the summer because they wanted to take care of their children during the summer. And so they assumed that I would not want to teach in the summer either because I had kids. So they were trying to do it for my own good, but I'm like, I'm a whole adult and you could ask me and I could make a decision based on my cost and benefits. And my costs and benefits were I needed the money and my kids were of age to go to camps and they needed that enrichment. And so it was a win-win for me to be able to teach in the summer. But it took a while to get someone to ask me what I wanted. And so there are these, Rosie talked a lot about the laws, the spoken pieces, but there are these unspoken rules of what you're expected to do as a woman, the role that you're expected to play. When I went to conferences early on, people would ask me, who has the children? It's like, well, their father does because he helped make them too, and he's responsible too. There were two adults in the room, but that idea of how could you be here professionally when you have children at home, that's something that, often holds women back professionally. So those to me are the big things of how can we address barriers that are there that we don't realize are there? And maybe we don't realize it until we walk in that person's shoes. I didn't think about childcare until I had children. I, didn't think about certain issues until I was faced with them on my own. And so the way to do that is to have those people as part of the conversation.
So I'm really glad that Kim brought up social norms and gender norms specifically, just societal expectations about what role women should or should not play, what role men should or should not play. Because those social norms often interact with policies in a very interesting and often unpredictable way. So we can pass a law that is intended to directly improve the outcome that we are interested in for women. So we can pass laws that mandate equal pay to try to mitigate the gender wage gap. We could pass laws that require quotas for corporate boards, gender quotas for corporate boards. Um, and if the social norms are still dictating that we don't think women should be in these spaces, right, the law is going to have some unintended consequences. So one interesting example that I think of it's from academia. There was a study a few years ago by an economist by the last name Antical, where they looked at a policy of trying to try to improve the odds that we have female faculty members in universities that are getting tenure because there's a big gap between the tenured faculty. There's a big gender gap in as you move up the ranks in universities. Fewer and fewer women make it to full professor and so on. So the idea was let's have a gender neutral policy that if you have a kid, whether you're male, female, if you have a kid in your family, we can pause the tenure clock just to give you a little bit more time to meet the requirements of tenure. And so what they found is as a result of this policy, it didn't improve the odds that women were going to get tenure. It actually decreased the odds that women would get tenure. It increased the odds that men would get tenure. And so you ask yourself, why? And well, you can say both of you can have this, semester of leave, but you can't control how people spend their time while they're on that leave, right? And so women, if the expectation is you're going to be caring for this baby 24/7, right? That woman is not going to be doing research while they're home. But a man is going to be in a better position to treat that as an additional sabbatical. I'll just anecdotally, like one of my colleagues, I only see him on campus when he teaches classes. He's a Tuesday, Thursday professor, so I only see him on campus when he teaches classes. The semester he had parental leave, I saw him almost every day, and he published so many papers. He was so incredibly productive. That's not necessarily why he was given leave, right? So we can pass these policies and from a top-down manner, but if social norms are still saying women aren't welcome in these spaces, women need to be taking on these specific roles, they're gonna not achieve the results that we desire, and they're expensive in a sense that we are taking options off the table for people. We are saying, you can't hire or enter into a contract in the way that you want to negotiate according to your own preferences. I'm somebody who doesn't want kids ever, right? And so I might have the opportunity to negotiate in my salary, like, you don't need to worry about me taking time off for kids. You don't need to worry about paying maternity leave. Maybe I can negotiate myself a higher salary. But if there's a law on the books that says every business is mandated by government to pay maternity leave, I can never negotiate credibly into a contract that I'm not going to have a kid, right? So these are, these are just a small sample of the ways that social norms can interact with well-intended policies in unexpected ways.
Somebody in the chat says your male colleague was breaking the law, Rosie. I get you busted him in public here. Good thing you didn't name him.
I didn't name names, but now I have leverage. Thank you.
Maybe it's not a good thing you didn't name him. I don't know. So I want to kind of take a slightly different angle on your question about the relationship between free markets and opportunities for women's advancement. So when we think about factory work in the 19th century, most people probably think of like late 19th, early 20th century. You have kind of that period in mind where there's a big transition in the quality of standard of, workplace safety standards and things like that. But the Industrial Revolution had been underway in the United States since at least the 1820s, actually a little bit earlier. Um, and women were very actively involved in factory work from the very beginning. And the reason that this is remarkable, whenever I talk about this history, I give the analogy, so many people today who are living in rural or agricultural parts of the United States, they leave home and they go to the big city for the first time when it's time to go to college. That's what these women were doing too, except they were doing it in a circumstance where nobody they know had ever gone to college. And in fact, nobody had even heard of college because factory work was new, industrial cities were brand new. So these women were encountering an entirely new kind of job opportunity that had come about through these open markets and economic growth that had enabled. And so those early factories, in order to attract and appeal to women workers, they had to do a lot of things that some of them might be benefits that we would like today. Some of them would not be benefits we would want. But they had to do things like uh, convince these young women's parents that they weren't going off into a life of sin. So they promised they'd go to Bible classes on Sunday. They had lecturers come in. This is not a time in which women had access to higher education, but these were women, like age 16 to 24, getting these outside lecturers coming in. They developed magazines, both the Lowell Offering and the Voice of Industry, which became a major union publication. Yes, the Lowell Mill Girls, exactly. And, a lot of these young women, they sent money back home. Their brothers were able to become doctors because of this. The United States at this time is very poor. Everybody's farming essentially. Their brothers could become doctors. They could pay for their own apartments. These women bought like pianos. They saved. There were banks that came up just to serve them. And one of the kind of unintended effects of this was a change in ideas about what women were capable of. So Susan B. Anthony's parents were actually textile mill owners. And some of her early experiences with the outside world and with seeing other adult women were the young women who came to work at this factory. So this is part of how she developed her beliefs about women's capability to be economically dependent. Everybody knew women could be economically dependent. She learned that they could be independent and that they could do their own work and take care of themselves. And of course, she went on to become one of the major figures in women's rights advocacy of the 19th century, and Seneca Falls Convention, and pushing for suffrage and pushing for a lot of the married women's property rights reforms, things like that. There's this dynamic, and this happens not just with respect to women. This happens with kind of oppressed groups in general. Slavery started as a system of exploitation, but it developed into an entire belief system about how it was necessary because Black persons were incapable of caring for themselves and they needed to be cared for. And it was better, and they lacked this capacity. Just kind of a possibly a legal simplicity, and a set of incentives to make sure that husbands took good care of their families. It evolved into this whole belief system that by the time we get to the 19th century, we have people questioning, well, I don't know, can women do this kind of work? Are they too weak? Can women think? We don't know anymore because we've not even given them the opportunity. So that's why John Stuart Mill writes in On the Subjection of Women, we don't know what women are capable of because we've never given them a chance. It's the same pattern that plays out in all kinds of oppression. And so I know that might seem like I went on a digression, but I think that's an actually really important piece of this puzzle about access to markets, because what it does is it gives you access to opportunity to show what you're capable of. And you're never going to get people to change their beliefs and the ideas unless there's that opportunity to show what you're capable of.
Can I add one thing? Access to markets, I also think a lack of access to markets makes women more vulnerable, right? So I like to think about, imagine a woman who is in a bad situation, maybe in an unpleasant marriage. How do you escape that situation without access to economic rights? If you are living in a country where you are allowed to participate in the economy, you're allowed to open up a bank account that your partner doesn't know about, you're allowed to move freely on your own without somebody else's permission, you might get a job, you might open up a secret bank account and start making moves to plan your escape. If you're in a society that limits women's access to economic rights, what ability do you have to escape that bad situation without, if you have to go through your husband and ask permission to get a job and you need his signature on a bank account, it's going to be really hard to escape that bad situation. So I think a lack of access to markets leaves women in a really vulnerable situation.
If I may add as well, Rosemary's done amazing research on this, gathering the data to really back it up. If you go to her website, womeninprogress.org, you can see how in countries where there is a high degree of economic freedom, over 90%. But in countries with a lower level of economic freedom, it's considerably lower, I believe less than 60%. Many more women are in the workforce in the more economically free countries. Many more women have their own bank accounts, partly because these are the countries where they tend to be allowed to have their own bank accounts without needing the permission of their husband. And women's life expectancy, which is probably the single best metric to distill someone's quality of life and their social status and so on, is also significantly higher in the economically free countries. Their women live to over 80 years on average, whereas in the least economically free countries, it's only about 65 years. So this has a big impact beyond just whether or not a woman's able to have a job and get the fulfillment of that itself. It affects their quality of life overall.
I completely agree. Right, when we're thinking about the historical context that you gave us, Jamie, I think that that's really important for, I mean, each of you touched on it, but particularly the grounding within the Industrial Revolution, which as you were saying that, I kept thinking about every time, and maybe the educators on this call might feel the same way, particularly if you're teaching social studies, talk about it all the time. It comes up in every history class that starts from 1800s onwards. It's recalled in AP US. It's throughout their entire middle to high school to some extent, even in the civics course. And this connection, and particularly getting to the nuances, like you were mentioning, around not just like when we're looking at the overall gender difference, but when we get to the race difference, and then, regionally, it's so very complex, yet so important for students to understand and break down and give time to, and then to make that connection of this is an economics topic. And, yes, of course, we're in a history class, or even if you're in a ELA class, it's really, really important to make the connection. Kim, I wanted to know if there was anything else you wanted to chime in about for this question in general.
I think they covered it. I'm good, but thank you.
Awesome. I have one final question. I'm going to definitely kick it to the audience questions, which is, just anchoring it again back to education. We have a group of educators on this call that are across the country, And when we think about the role of education in promoting societal shifts and attitudes in general, but focusing on this conversation specifically, we're thinking about how it might shift attitudes around greater economic mobility for women. What needs to be done to ensure that both women and the broader public are educated about the importance of this issue? What's maybe one specific takeaway or nugget of knowledge that we can provide teachers across disciplines to share as a starting point for bringing these conversations to the classroom, given that it is so complex, it's so palpable. We have access to Instagram, all the social media where we're seeing trends like tradwife or whatever it might be, and the rhetoric, as each of you had mentioned, is just really a lot for the general public, but particularly when we think about kids. So would love to hear your thoughts. Kim, let's start with you, and then can go Jamie, Chelsea, and Rosemary.
Yeah, the trad wife trend is funny to me as someone who stayed home with my kids and was a very traditional wife, and then ended up back in school and have had a whole kind of second career. And when you're home with your kids, you're judged there, and when you're not at home with the kids, you're judged there. You kind of can't win. Um, I would say my kind of take home message to people would be that you have to build a classroom where it's okay to talk about these things. You have to build respect inside your classroom for different ideas. In theory, it should start in the home. If it doesn't, you're the next step, right? You're the last call before they go out into society, and you have to build that mutual respect for differing ideas and differing opinions, and that it's okay for people to have different opinions. Everyone comes from their own space. They come from their own sense of traditions or culture, or what they see as the norm. And we can only kind of come together if we're free to talk about it, even about difficult things. And so, what I notice a lot when I talk with other people is when it comes to issues such as gender or race, things that are touchy, they feel a little uncomfortable, particularly if you're a male teacher and trying to talk about women's issues. That can be difficult. So, what could you do? You could think about just pairing these conversations when you're talking about history. Throw in some of these other examples. They're important too. You don't have to celebrate Women's History Month, but you can just sprinkle it in, and just provide opportunities for all of the people in your classroom to kind of talk about these things. And my last kind of soapbox thing is respectfully, I don't love the word empowerment. Like, empowerment means that power comes from an external source and that someone is giving me power to speak. But my personhood gives me the power to speak. So, it's really about women standing on their own. Nobody has to like lift me up. They just kind of have to get out of my way, is what I like to say. Just like stop throwing up arbitrary barriers in front of me. And I would say the same for the women that are in your classroom. Is just, don't throw up arbitrary barriers that don't have to be there. You don't have to empower them. Just move to the side a little bit.
That's great. And it's such a great question. It's kind of the $1 million question for an economist, actually. How do you have that conversation for people who are skeptical of any kind of access to markets that encourages them to kind of reconsider or give it a shot? A lot of economics textbooks, they focus on trying to find exceptions and special cases. They build models that can be isolated from the real world. But there's kind of this root insight at the beginning of the book that sometimes gets lost. And it goes back to Adam Smith. And it's that trading with another individual is positive sum. And so if there's a way to emphasize that allowing women to voluntarily choose to participate in all kinds of trade, whether that's through the job they do, through direct production, whatever it might be, if you can kind of shift the dialogue around that, I think that that is one of the big obstacles because there's a real fear that women's advancement takes, and in general, this is always the risk whenever you talk about a particular group. There's a real risk, or there's a real fear that some people are going to have that that group getting ahead is going to hurt them. And so if you kind of shift that framing and can have that conversation about, hey, actually, it's positive some in the long run, and you don't have to deny that somebody might lose a job. You know, if only men can weld and now women are allowed to weld, then some male welders might lose their job. Some of them might see their salaries go down. You don't have to deny that, but in a positive sum framework, the fact that there are those short-term costs, it does not overwhelm either the philosophical argument for stopping oppression and exclusion, and it does not overwhelm the economic argument either because of the long run growth and the benefits to future generations that come from that liberation and inclusion. Um, so I don't know if there's, you know, I'm not the person who talks to high schoolers all the time. I will say that I work at the Mercatus Center. We do have one fellowship that invites high school students to apply and have discussion-based conversations around economic ideas. Um, and they're usually wonderful and they are so kind of critical and open to learning and so um you know, but I probably get, you know, just the special students who are willing to do like extra class on Saturday. So, you know, I'm not the one who's going to be able to say how we actually change it in the classroom. Um, but yeah, I hope we can shift that narrative so that other people, different people, whether that's women or people of different races or immigrants, people who currently live outside the country, if we can shift that narrative so that people are no longer seen as threats, but wonderful for us because we can have new participants in our positive sum game. Um, I think that's kind of what it's all about at the end of the day.
I love that. I think we've been talking a lot about women empowering themselves, if Kim will forgive me for using the word empower, through the workplace. And I know that we mentioned trad wives. I just want to clarify that it's not necessarily that I think that women need to be in the workplace to empower themselves. I think that if a woman or a man for that matter wants to be a stay-at-home parent, that is completely valid if that's what they and their partner decide. And it's about just choice and options. But importantly, I think we should remember that there is no country in the world that legally restricts a woman's right to be a homemaker or to be a stay-at-home mom. There are still many places around the world where there are genuine legal restrictions and also norms that prevent women from being in the workplace or engaging with certain occupations. So that's just important for perspective. But bringing it back to education, it's also important to recognize that globally, many girls are not able to access education. This is just another case of the fact that a lot of this liberation process we've been talking about as a historical phenomenon is in fact ongoing. So consider laundry. It's something that is often brought up as one of the big labor-saving technological changes that helped women to enter the workplace. If you look at a graph of women's unpaid work hours on housework, it goes down and as sort of a mirror image of their participation in the workforce going up. So this definitely affected women's ability to work. It's been said by one economist, Ha-Joon Chang of Cambridge University, that the laundry machine changed women's lives more than the internet. arguably true. There's a wonderful TED Talk by the late Dr. Hans Rosling called The Magic Laundry Machine that I encourage everyone to watch if you haven't already. But the short version is that laundry went from something that took a full day every week to something that now takes virtually no time. The task is done by machines. In the rich countries, that is not the case everywhere. This is still ongoing. We are in a situation now where I've seen estimates that as many as 60% of the people in this world, about 5 billion people, are still doing laundry by hand the way our ancestors did. And the people doing that work are, to be clear, women almost always. And so you've got people from their youth engaging in housework activities without the aid of electricity or technology, and that leaves them less time to work, also less time to go to school. Often, if you are a young girl in many countries, you are expected to be cooking, which can be a full-time job as well, doing laundry, doing housework, helping to raise your younger siblings. And this is considered more important than your education, you're going to school. So maybe that's sort of a different take on the education question, but just to recognize that many girls around the world do not have that opportunity at all, I think is an important perspective for students to have today, and also to recognize that historically, when you look at the great innovators of the past in a book like Heroes of Progress, which we've got so many great lesson plans out of, you will notice if you go through the chapter list of that book that there are more men listed than women. And that's largely because in the past, women were denied the educational opportunities to get into a lot of these fields that saved millions of lives objectively, like medicine. And there were many trailblazers and exceptions that are included in this book that are very inspiring. But the reason that often the great inventors of the past, the great innovators, were disproportionately men in many cases is because women did not have the educational opportunities or the career opportunities to become innovators. And so I think that's also an important perspective to keep.
So I would say, just from an educator perspective, I'm a data person, and so I'm somebody who, like, if you go to the womeninprogress.org, there's going to be a lot of graphics with a lot of data, and that's useful, right? So that might be illuminating to some people, but I think high school students, I think stories might be more impactful. So, telling the human aspect and the anecdotes that really connect the importance of economic rights to women's well-being. I always tell my students about my sister. My older sister's amazing. She's a doctor. My mom would say she's the actual doctor, not the PhD doctor, right? And my sister, she works in operating rooms. She saves lives all the time. And a couple of decades ago, the world would not have been able to benefit from the talent and the skills. There are lives that are here today that wouldn't be if my sister wasn't able to have the permission to kind of pursue that life path, right? And so connecting these lessons with stories, and I think somebody in the chat mentioned, local stories, local entrepreneurs, sing the praises of actual people and how economic rights have had a meaningful impact on their ability to flourish.
Absolutely. Thank you each for highlighting each of these really important points, particularly when it comes to economics. As you just said, Rosie, like we think about data and we think about how do we really make this tangible for students to understand, given the historical context, and then the actual economic concepts. So I think that each of you bring up a really important point that the students really need to understand, and really great strategies to provide educators that are on this webinar. And I think just one other point that is really important to bring to bear for your students in your class is that this is not just a global issue where women are prevented from, if we're thinking about that, the education piece that you mentioned, Chelsea, of going to school, it's domestic too, depending on where it is, of certain barriers hindering students that might have to have multiple jobs and take care of siblings that are in high school. And might drop out and they're doing their GD, right? There's so many different narratives that exist. And a wonderful way to do that is through oral storytelling, narratives, amplifying, different examples and cases for your students. Going back to the rhetoric piece, just really briefly, and then I want to get to some of the questions that were in the chat, is we have a rhetoric unit. It is in two of our collections. It is in our civil discourse and also our literature collection, but it is really interdisciplinary. It's discipline agnostic. You can put it into different classes that you might be teaching. It is something that you can use sequentially or you can use independently depending on where you are at in your curriculum. It is just really there to support you in trying to get students to understand what the role of what rhetoric is first and foremost, of course, but also what role it plays in their everyday lives between being in person in class to when they're online on social media, right? It's just trying to help them really understand that. And then that's a really important piece when we're considering how do we bring civil discourse to the classroom to really delve deep into these complex topics. So that unit is in the chat. There's a link there that Kobe sent. We also have some really wonderful templates you can use, such as our Brave class norms as part of our middle school toolkit, but it allows you to create a class contract essentially about what sort of discussion norms you want to have with your students. And we mentioned Brave. It's very Brene Brown, but really, truly just trying to share. We want to create a space where students can bring their whole selves to discussion, but to also bring it where when they leave the classroom and they are in career mode, right? Maybe they already are in high school, depending on what they're doing. But when we're thinking about their college and career, we want them to be prepared to have these conversations. So with that, I want to kick it to some of the questions from the chat. We have just a couple. The first is going back a bit to the beginning of the conversation when we talked about historical context. Why should we promote the idea that women should have equal economic rights to land ownership and access? Isn't access to land a social question rather than individual? It's open to anybody on the panel that might want to take this. And I'm happy to repeat the question as well.
I think that it's a very important point. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example, which is the poorest region in the world today, in some cases, that poverty is perpetuated by a lack of free enterprise, economic freedom, and that often includes poor rule of law and poor property rights, sometimes in a gender unequal manner. And when women do not have equal access to property rights, the entire economy suffers.
Jamie, I saw you were going to add to that.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think it's a great question. I saw some research the other day, and I apologize, I won't be able to remember the author off the top of my head, but I can certainly find it and share it later to anybody who's interested. But over 80% of privately owned land in UK is still owned by men. And that's just one relatively recent illustration of how the property rights practices that you have at one moment in time can wind up really having a significant impact on people's ability to generate wealth and build and advance a better life for themselves. I don't know if part of the question was about whether it would be more egalitarian if we did not have private property and did not have private ownership of land. Um, I I'm less convinced of that, but I am very convinced that if you have any period of time where the ability to become a private owner of land is restricted to just a specific subset of individuals, that's going to entrench those individuals' power within that society. And so it's a situation that should be kind of avoided at all costs.
Rosie or Kim, anything additional?
I love how we kind of each come to this from our own specialty. And so the educator, but specifically personal finance person in me, land is just an asset. And it's important for women to own assets of their own. specifically because women tend to outlive men, at least here in the United States. And so we need to have our own pool of money for a lot of the reasons that Rosie talked about, just for independence and freedom and our ability to choose, but also just for wealth generation. And so women need to take responsibility for their own financial health. And part of that is, as Scarlett O'Hara kind of said, like owning this land is important. And tying it into your local stories, I live near Berry College, the largest land grant university in the United States, which was established by Martha Berry because she liked to own land. And so she slowly bought it up. And so women have done amazing things with that power. So I think you can tie in some of those things. But I think David has clarified his question a little bit in the chat too.
Upon seeing his clarification and scrolling back through some of the details he gave about his question, I think what he's asking is actually about a Georgist property tax system, which is a really interesting idea that's been around for a while. I'll admit that I am not a tax policy expert, so I don't have a strong opinion on it. But obviously, anything that does lead to more economic growth, which proponents of that system believe it would do, would benefit women as well as men. It can perpetuate, like Jamie was saying, norms that even last longer than you think and have very far-reaching effects related to norms. One thing we haven't discussed that I think is very important to this conversation is that differentiation in unpaid labor, that comes from norms, right? That's not legally mandated anywhere. That's just from norms. But we do see a difference in different areas of the world. And today, the areas of the world that are the least gender unequal on unpaid housework and unpaid childcare, although they're still unequal, but they're just the least unequal, are North America and Western Europe, which are also the wealthiest areas of the world. So I think that says that there is a connection between economic development and norms, including norms of gender equality. So I'm sorry, I don't know more about the actual Georgist proposal, but if it did work to make a more prosperous society, then yes, I agree it would also benefit women.
Thanks for that. And thank you for the clarification, David. Just moving to the next question, because I do want to be mindful of time. When we talk about economics and we talk about women, of course, there could be a lot of generalizations that are made, and there's a lot of nuance there. When we are thinking about this, and even we can break this down further into the context of trying to explain this to students, are there differences between the ways that economics affects women dependent upon their race? When we speak about this, again, particularly to students, given the context of this webinar, what's a good starting point that we can use? How can we help students better understand the breakdown? Even going back to the question that we asked earlier around unintended and intended consequences from laws that are looked at as trying to help women holistically. But of course, we know that there's different components to that.
So when we were the way we are talking, we're generally talking about the average woman's experience, and you are going to see some variation when you break that down into different racial categories, different ethnic categories. But I do think this framework about talking about inequality from a gendered perspective does offer a nice similar framework to talk about racial inequality. Just as Jamie was talking about the historical kind of legacy of limiting women's property rights in the past, there's a historical legacy of things like Jim Crow laws, right? We still see a lot of racial differences in measures of well-being that can be traced back to historically limiting the economic access of marginalized groups of people.
And I think that it does add another dimension when you're trying to give children historical perspective, when you remind them that as difficult as things were for all women in terms of the maternal mortality rate, the high rate of death of their children, the fact that they were going through many childbirths and the majority of their children were not surviving, the fact that they were also spending so much of their lives on housework that has now been delegated to machines. That was true for the free women, but if you're going back far enough in history, enslaved women obviously had even fewer options open to them.
Absolutely. Any additional points, Kim?
I I was getting ready to throw it in the chat, but I'll just say it back to Kelly's point that's in the chat is that it is difficult to have these conversations depending upon the student group that you're in. And I've always taught at state institutions and in ones in more rural areas. And so most students work. Most students aren't, your traditional college student who can take this traditional path. And so when you start talking and breaking things down, when I teach macro, like when you start breaking things down by race and gender, people get hurt, in their feelings because it's not great to see some of those graphs and to realize that things are stacked against you. But the great equalizer is education. So when you also then put in place degree attainment, and say there's a lot of things you can't fix in the world. People are going to view you a certain way. But one thing you can do is stay in school. You can, that can be something that you have control over. I found that helped my students at least give them a pathway or a solution, an opportunity to kind of ease those conversations. And I was in a very privileged position as a person of color, but also part of the model minority where I can find these conversations a little easier to navigate. But you don't have to do it alone. You just have to facilitate the conversation with your students and build that respect.
I think that's a great point. And again, just highlighting our resources. These are, as each of the panelists have mentioned, really hard topics when you get down into the nitty-gritty of it, and it can spark uncomfortable conversations. But uncomfortability does not mean that it should not happen. And this, students spend the majority of their time with their educators. They spend it more than they do with their parents or guardians. It's really important that you act as a facilitator where, you don't have to know every single answer to everything, but feel prepared to facilitate conversations related to, of course, economics, but whatever it might be in your discipline, and particularly in this topic at hand right now for this question, when getting into the nuance of these different components and factors. Our primer can really help benefit you with some tips and tricks about that, from class setup to how you enter the classroom and discussion setting, to, again, the rhetoric unit, Brave Class Norms. We have a lot of really good resources for you to just get jump started on that. So that way you don't feel like you have to shy away from these conversations. One last question that came up, and it's a little bit more technical, related to, I believe, Rosie, you were the one that mentioned the pesticide example.
Yeah, I saw that in the chat. So somebody
Yes.
had asked, is it really we have this law because we don't think women will succeed in that space, or do we have this law to protect their health, right? And so I do think a lot of the restrictions on women's labor market choices can be traced back to we want to protect their reproductive capabilities, right? The pesticides, we want to make sure that women can have healthy babies, right? But I just want to point out again that not everybody wants that outcome. And a woman who doesn't want kids or is finished having kids should be able to make that choice for herself, and even a woman who does want kids should be able to internally weigh those costs and benefits, right? Is this risk going to outweigh the potential benefit of this job opportunity? That's not for me to say. The individual is going to have much better information about that.
I just love to add to that there are some complications with allowing that decision of whether it's a safe enough chemical, allowing that to become a political decision where it's then banned, has some negative unintended consequences. And the history, historically, what Rosie's saying is exactly right. This is literally how it started. The very first kind of in the United States, the first labor laws that restricted women's work were that they thought working too long of hours would hurt pregnancies. They thought being on your feet too long and getting tired would hurt pregnancies. It really was about this kind of paternalistic, we can't allow women to do anything that might impede them having as many babies as possible. There are racial origins to that because this was during the progressive era when they were particularly concerned about white women in the United States not having enough babies because they thought there were too many immigrants and um, minorities having children. And I know that we're out of time, but a lot of the data too on whether chemicals, activities hurt women, we actually don't have medically because you're not allowed to do medical testing on pregnant women. And for that reason, many medical studies have excluded women at all stages of their life. So oftentimes it's guesswork anyway, unless it's, a particular known specific cause. So I'm always a little skeptical of that kind of protective impulse as a good enough justification to prevent women from work.
It was a great question, Kelly. And, I think we could have another hour-long webinar just on that point alone of investment into women's health research, the issues and factors there. That's not just domestically, but globally in the historical context there. It's very complex and rich and unfortunately not covered enough within history classes or in ELA classes. For those that might assign Henrietta Lacks, it's really interesting, or just in general, if you're talking about really any topic, it comes up. I know we're out of time, so I will stop with that, but we will put plenty of resources in the follow-up email that we will provide to each of you. So I know Kim had thrown one example in the chat about some resources that she has that she can share. We'll gather any other resources that are relevant to provide each of you. It'll be in addition to the recording. You'll be hearing from us with that recording and those links, but also the professional development certificate. Thank you all for joining. Thank you to our amazing panel for touching on all these important points, but especially just getting the conversation started because we know that there's so much more to discuss. And unfortunately, we just don't have the time for wrapping up all the different topics that we need to hit on. So thank you so much for joining us. And for those that are on spring break, have an amazing spring break.